Those words weren't part of a movie script. They weren't from a suspense novel. They were real. And they were the Browns' reality. The moment Kody Brown heard them, his heart sank. His wife Mary's hands froze mid-packing of the dinner plates. Christine gasped, covering her mouth. Robin, the newest wife at the time, clutched her baby a little tighter. And Janelle? She stared at the floor, processing the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't just moving house. This was running for their lives. Running from the law. Up until that moment, the Browns had been living in a quiet Utah suburb. From the outside, they looked like any other large, bustling family. Except, of course, they weren't like any other family. Kody Brown, father of 18 children, was legally married to Mary, but also spiritually married to 3 other women: Janelle, Christine, and Robin. Together they formed a sprawling polygamous household. In 2010, their unique lifestyle became the subject of TLC's Sister Wives. Cameras rolled through their kitchens as they prepared massive family dinners. They followed the chaos of back-to-school mornings. They captured laughter around the dinner table, late-night family meetings, and the occasional bickering between sister wives. Viewers either loved them or judged them, but no one could stop watching. What the cameras didn't capture at first, though, was the tension building beneath the surface. Utah's anti-bigamy laws didn't just frown on polygamy, they criminalized it. It didn't matter to the state if Kody's marriages to his other wives weren't legal on paper. In their eyes, living together as husband and wife, even spiritually, was still a crime. And now, that crime was catching up to them. It wasn't a dramatic police raid in the middle of the night. No flashing lights, no officers shouting commands. The threat came quietly, through a whisper, a warning. Someone had tipped them off. An investigation was underway. An investigator had opened a file. Their faces, their home, their relationships, all now part of a case. And if the state moved forward, Kody could be arrested. The wives could be arrested. The children could be taken into state custody. They didn't have time to debate or plan. They had one day, 24 hours, to pack up their lives and get out of Utah. Imagine trying to move an entire family of over 20 people in a single day. The kids were told to grab their essentials: clothes, school books, their favorite toys. But when you're a child, how do you choose between your stuffed animal and the blanket your grandma made? Between the football your dad gave you and the photo album of your cousins? Meanwhile, the wives were in the kitchen, hurriedly wrapping dishes in towels, dumping pantry items into boxes, and labeling everything with black marker. Kody moved through the house with a focused urgency. His mind was a checklist. Arrange moving trucks. Keep the kids calm. Avoid alerting the neighbors. Leave before anyone could see. Every hour that passed felt like the walls were closing in. Every sound outside made them glance at the window, wondering if it was the police. For Christine, Utah wasn't just home. It was her roots, her family history. The thought of leaving under these circumstances cut deep. For Mary, it was a cocktail of fear and frustration. She had agreed to share her husband in a way most people couldn't imagine. But now, it wasn't just about sharing. It was about survival. Janelle, usually the most level-headed, fought back tears as she taped shut the last box of her office supplies. She had built her life here. She had friends, a job, stability. And now, it was gone in an instant. Robin, still adjusting to life in the Brown family, couldn't believe this was happening. She had joined this marriage for love, for faith, for family, not to become a fugitive. As night fell, the moving trucks rolled quietly out of the driveway. The kids were scattered between cars, some asleep, some staring silently out the windows at the city lights fading behind them. Kody drove with one eye on the road and one on the rearview mirror. In his mind, the questions played on a loop. Would they be followed? Was this really the end of their life in Utah? How would the show continue after this? The convoy crossed the state line into Nevada, under the cover of darkness. No sirens, no arrests, just a tense, heavy silence. For the first time in hours, they allowed themselves to breathe. Their destination was Las Vegas, a city famous for its bright lights, its endless reinvention, and its tolerance for lifestyles that didn't fit the norm. Here they could blend in. Here they could start over. But the move didn't erase the truth. They were still a polygamous family, and the laws they had fled from still existed. The cameras would follow them to Nevada, but so would the controversy. The Browns knew they hadn't escaped the bigger battle. They had only postponed it. Kody's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let his family live in hiding. He wasn't going to let the law dictate their faith or their home life. This wasn't over. The next chapter of the Browns' story wouldn't just play out in living rooms across America. It would be fought in courtrooms, in legal briefs, and in front of judges. The Browns had left Utah to avoid prison, but soon, they'd be walking straight into the fight of their lives, not running from it. When the Browns arrived in Nevada, they had escaped the immediate threat of Utah police. No officers were knocking on their doors. No prosecutor was building a case against them. At least not anymore. But safety in Las Vegas didn't erase the shadow that followed them. It didn't silence the whispers. It didn't remove the stain of the word criminal hanging over their family. Every time Kody walked into a grocery store, he could feel eyes on him. People recognized him from Sister Wives. Some smiled, some frowned, and some looked at him like he was doing something dirty. That was the thing about running. You could change your address, but you couldn't outrun the narrative. For Kody Brown, the move to Nevada wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a mission. He could have stayed quiet, kept filming the show, and hoped that Utah would eventually forget about him. But that wasn't Kody's nature. "This isn't just about me," he told his wives one night around the dinner table. "This is about every family like ours. The ones who live in fear. The ones who hide their kids from the camera. The ones who can't go to church without worrying someone will turn them in." The wives exchanged glances. They all knew families like that. They'd grown up in communities where polygamy was a way of life, where it wasn't about abuse or control, but about faith and family. And yet those families had to pretend they didn't exist. If Kody could change that, even a little, maybe the next generation wouldn't have to live in hiding. In 2011, the Browns made their move. They filed a federal lawsuit, Brown v. Booman. The Booman in the case was Jeff Booman, the Utah County attorney at the time. He had built a reputation for being tough on polygamy cases, and now he was the face of the law. The Browns were challenging. Their target wasn't just Booman personally. It was the entire Utah legal system's approach to cohabitation. Under Utah law, it was illegal to be legally married to one person and live with another person, as if you were married to them. This meant that even if Kody's spiritual marriages to Janelle, Christine, and Robin weren't legally binding, the fact that they lived together and presented themselves as a family could be used to prosecute him. The Browns argued this law violated their constitutional rights, specifically, their rights to religious freedom and privacy. Here's how they saw it. No harm, no crime. They weren't defrauding anyone. They weren't forcing anyone into marriage. Everyone in their family was there by choice. Religious freedom. In their faith, plural marriage was a spiritual calling. Why should the government have the power to tell them they couldn't live according to their beliefs? Privacy. The law as written reached into the bedrooms and living rooms of consenting adults. "This is about more than us," Kody told a reporter at the time. "This is about whether the government can decide who you can love, who you can live with, and how you choose to raise your family." The lawsuit made headlines across the country. News anchors debated whether the Browns were brave or reckless. Some praised them for standing up to an outdated law. Others accused them of using their TV fame to push an agenda. Social media exploded. Fans of Sister Wives rallied behind the Browns, posting messages of support and sharing stories of other plural families living in fear. Critics flooded comment sections with moral outrage. And through it all, the Browns kept filming. TLC cameras captured them talking to their lawyers, discussing legal strategy over coffee, and reassuring their children that everything would be okay. Filing a lawsuit like this wasn't without danger. The Browns were putting themselves directly in the spotlight of the very system they were challenging. Their legal team warned them if this went badly, it could make things worse, not just for them, but for every other polygamous family. A failed court case could cement Utah's right to prosecute plural marriages, and give prosecutors more confidence to do so. Kody understood the stakes. "If we lose big," he admitted in one episode. But if we win, maybe we can change everything. Preparing for battle, the legal team built their case around a key point. Utah's anti-bigamy law wasn't just about preventing fraud or protecting minors. It criminalized the act of living with someone as a spouse, even if both people were adults and consented. They gathered evidence, historical examples of polygamy in religious communities, testimonies from families who had faced harassment or threats of arrest, statistics showing that Utah's law was rarely used against abusive situations, but often against families like the Browns who were simply open about their lifestyle. The Browns were ready to tell their story, not just in court but to the entire nation. The months between filing the lawsuit and getting a court date felt endless. Life in Las Vegas went on. The kids went to school. The wives managed their households. Kody balanced filming schedules with legal meetings. But the court case loomed over everything. Every phone call from their lawyer sent a ripple of tension through the house. Was this the big update? Was Utah going to back down? No, Utah was ready to fight. By the time the first hearings began, it was clear this wasn't just about one family's right to live together. This was a direct challenge to the state's power to define marriage-like relationships. If the Browns won, it could set a precedent that affected other states with similar laws. The media coverage grew. Outside the courthouse, cameras jostled for position. Supporters held signs reading "Freedom for all families." Opponents carried signs quoting scripture against polygamy. Inside, Kody sat with his wives, trying to project confidence. But when the judge entered the room, even he felt the weight of the moment. By filing Brown v. Bowman, the Browns had done more than just defend themselves. They had lit a match in the middle of a political and cultural powder keg. The courtroom battle ahead would test their convictions, their patience, and their public image. The law was clear. Their beliefs were clear. What wasn't clear was which would win when the gavel fell. The legal arguments came down to one razor-sharp question. Could the state of Utah criminalize the private relationships of consenting adults? It was a question that cut to the heart of the Browns' fight, and one that had the power to change the law for thousands of people across the state. In the months before the court date, the tension in the Brown household was almost unbearable. The lawyers had drilled Kody and the wives with questions. What will you say if they ask about your faith? What if they accuse you of exploiting women? What if they bring up your children? The wives practiced their answers. They wanted the judge to see them not as a polygamy case, but as real people, mothers, partners, a family. Even the kids, though not directly involved, felt the weight. They overheard snippets of legal terms they didn't understand. They saw the way their parents whispered after phone calls. They understood in their own way that what happened in that courtroom could change their lives forever. December 2013. The courthouse in Salt Lake City was buzzing with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Inside, the courtroom was all polished wood and heavy silence. The Browns sat at one table, Kody in a dark suit, the wives in muted, professional colors. Across from them sat Utah's legal team, flanked by their own stack of binders and exhibits. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The arguments began. Utah's lawyers argued that the state had a legitimate interest in banning cohabitation and polygamous arrangements. They said the law protected against potential harms often associated with polygamy, such as underage marriage, coercion, and welfare fraud. They insisted the law wasn't about targeting religion. It was about protecting public policy and preventing abuse. One attorney even suggested that allowing polygamous cohabitation could open the door to more extreme forms of marriage arrangements. The state wasn't prepared to regulate. The Browns' counterattack. The Browns' legal team came back hard. They reminded the court that Kody was only legally married to one wife. His other marriages were purely spiritual, symbolic commitments between consenting adults. No underage brides, no coercion, no welfare fraud. Just a family who believed their faith called them to this way of life. They argued that the law was too broad. Instead of targeting abuse, it criminalized the very act of living with another adult and calling them your spouse. That, they said, was a violation of both the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom and the 14th Amendment's guarantee of privacy and liberty. This isn't about approving or disapproving of polygamy, one of the Browns' attorneys told the judge. It's about whether the government can reach into the homes of consenting adults and criminalize their relationships simply because of disapproval. Throughout the hearing, the judge listened carefully, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions. To the state, if your concern is abuse or coercion, why not target those acts directly, instead of criminalizing all forms of cohabitation and plural marriage? To the Browns, if the law is changed, how would you address the state's concern about preventing exploitation? These questions weren't just procedural, they signaled that the judge was thinking about the broader implications. After the hearing ended, the Browns went home to Nevada and waited. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The legal team said it could be a long time before the judge issued a ruling. During that time, the family tried to live normally. They filmed new episodes, went to school events, celebrated birthdays. But the looming question was always there. What will the judge decide? Then, in December 2013, the news broke. A federal judge in Salt Lake City had ruled in favor of the Browns. The court struck down the part of Utah's anti-bigamy law that prohibited cohabitation with another partner. The judge agreed that this portion of the law violated the Browns' constitutional rights. It was a legal earthquake. The ruling effectively decriminalized the act of living with multiple partners in Utah, as long as there was only one legal marriage. When the call came from their attorney, the Browns were in shock. Kody's first words were almost a whisper. "We won." Mary burst into tears. Christine hugged Robin. Janelle sat back in her chair, smiling in disbelief. For the first time since leaving Utah, they felt truly free. They could visit family there without worrying about being arrested. They could talk about their faith openly, without fearing prosecution. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like history had been made. The ruling made national headlines. Some outlets called it a win for religious freedom. Others called it a dangerous step toward legitimizing polygamy. Kody appeared on talk shows, explaining that this wasn't about forcing polygamy on anyone. It was about giving people the right to choose their own relationships without government interference. Supporters flooded social media with congratulations. Opponents warned of a slippery slope. The debate was louder than ever, but for the Browns, the legal win felt like validation. But victories in court are rarely the final chapter. Utah's Attorney General's office immediately announced they would appeal the ruling. They argued that the judge's decision weakened the state's ability to prevent the harms they associated with polygamy. The appeal meant the case would go to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, a higher court with the power to overturn the Browns' win. The Browns braced themselves for another round. The victory had felt like a mountaintop moment. But now, it was clear they weren't done climbing. Kody tried to keep morale high, but privately, he knew appeals could be unpredictable. Winning at the trial court was one thing. Holding on to that win through the appeals process was another. The wives prepared themselves mentally for another long legal slog. They had already spent years and tens of thousands of dollars on this fight. Now they had to dig in again. The call came on a quiet afternoon in 2016. By then, years had passed since that first tense court hearing. The Browns had moved on in some ways. New seasons of Sister Wives, changes in family dynamics, kids growing older, but the shadow of the lawsuit still lingered. They had been waiting for the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals to decide their fate. This was the higher court, the one that could confirm their historic win or erase it entirely. When the phone rang, Kody answered with a mix of hope and dread. The news hit like a punch to the gut. Dismissed. Not reversed on the merits. Not a ruling that said, "You were wrong." Just dismissed. The judges said the case was moot. What moot really meant in legal terms. Moot means the case is no longer relevant for the court to decide. That there's nothing left for them to resolve. The appeals court reasoned that the Browns no longer lived in Utah. Utah had changed its enforcement policy. They were no longer actively prosecuting polygamists, unless there were other crimes involved, like underage marriage, abuse, or fraud. In other words, you left the state and the state isn't coming after you anymore. So why should we rule on this? It was a technicality, a procedural exit ramp that allowed the court to avoid making a broad constitutional decision. The Browns' reaction when Kody hung up. The house was silent. Mary was the first to speak. "So? That's it?" Christine shook her head. "That can't be it. They didn't even decide?" Janelle leaned back in her chair, stunned. Years of work, Years of stress. And they just don't care anymore? Robin sat quietly, tears forming in her eyes. She had always hoped the lawsuit would be about more than just their family, that it would help other plural families come out of hiding. For Kody, it was more than disappointment. It was a feeling of being robbed. They hadn't lost on principle. They hadn't been told their beliefs were wrong, or their arguments invalid. They had been told the fight didn't matter anymore. As if the years of fear, the risk of arrest, the emotional toll on the family were just irrelevant. The emotional toll. The legal journey had been grueling. Financial cost. Tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, travel expenses, and court filings. Public cost, endless interviews, media scrutiny, and online criticism. Family cost, the stress of living under a lawsuit for half a decade. To have it all end without a final ruling on the merits felt like a betrayal. The legal lesson, their attorneys explained the hard truth. Appellate courts often avoid big constitutional rulings if they can. By calling the case moot, the 10th Circuit sidestepped having to declare Utah's cohabitation ban unconstitutional for everyone. This meant the original trial court win, the one that had given the Browns hope, was wiped away, with no legal precedent left behind. The public reaction when the news broke. Headlines were quieter this time. Some outlets portrayed it as a loss for the Browns. Others framed it as the court ducking the big question. Fans were frustrated. Supporters of the Browns posted online that the dismissal was cowardly, that it left thousands of families without the clarity they deserved. Critics saw it as a relief, saying the court had avoided legitimizing polygamy. But either way, the Browns' case had kept the issue in the public eye for years. And that had consequences. A shift in the law. While the Browns hadn't secured a lasting legal victory, their fight had lit a fire under the conversation about polygamy laws in Utah. Lawmakers, legal scholars, and advocacy groups debated whether the harsh felony penalties for consensual plural marriages made sense in the modern era. In 2020, 4 years after the dismissal, Utah passed a new law. Consensual polygamy between adults was downgraded from a felony to an infraction, the equivalent of a traffic ticket. It wasn't full legalization. It didn't remove all risks, but it was a massive shift in tone, reducing the threat of prison for families like the Browns. And while the Browns weren't directly credited in the bill's language, insiders acknowledged that their high-profile lawsuit and TV exposure had played a role in pushing the issue into the spotlight. The quiet legacy. Kody knew the court's dismissal meant they hadn't won a legal precedent, but he also knew they'd changed the conversation. Before Sister Wives, many Americans didn't even know Utah's cohabitation laws existed. Fewer still knew that simply living with another partner could be a felony. Now, thanks to years of public discussion, that was common knowledge. And the law had been softened. The Browns' fight had forced people to ask uncomfortable questions. Should the government criminalize relationships between consenting adults? Where is the line between protecting people from abuse and intruding on personal choice? And should religious beliefs play a role in defining marriage? Even if the court never answered those questions, the public had started to. The closing chapter, the dismissal in 2016, felt, in the moment, like a defeat. But over time, the Browns came to see it differently. They hadn't gotten the headline they wanted. Browns win historic polygamy case. Instead, they got something quieter, but maybe just as important. A shift in the law, a broader awareness, and a sense that their struggle had made it easier for other families to live without fear. For Kody, that was enough to call it a kind of victory. Sometimes, he told a documentary crew later, you don't get the win you want, but you still change the world a little bit, and that's worth fighting for. Today, Kody Brown's life looks nothing like it did when this legal saga began. The sprawling plural marriage that once defined him has shifted dramatically. Some of his marriages have ended. Others have changed, and the Sister Wives storyline has evolved from the daily chaos of one giant household to the complexities of separation, personal growth, and redefining family. Yet, no matter how much his personal life changes, the shadow of that courtroom battle still lingers. The case that changed him. When people talk about Kody Brown now, they often focus on the drama of Sister Wives, the arguments, the breakups, the emotional moments that draw millions of viewers each season. But those who followed closely remember that before the show became about internal family conflict, it was about survival. It was about a man, 4 women, and 18 children taking on an entire legal system. That fight left a mark, not just on the Browns, but on Kody himself. He once described the lawsuit as the most exhausting, all-consuming thing I've ever done in my life. It forced him to become not just a husband and father, but a spokesperson for an entire community that often stayed silent out of fear. That lawsuit wasn't just about whether Kody Brown could live in a house with multiple women. It was about something far larger. How much power should the government have over the personal lives of consenting adults? It's a question that stretches far beyond polygamy. If the government can criminalize your living arrangements because of moral disapproval, where does it stop? Can it tell you who you can live with, love, or commit to? Can it outlaw your beliefs simply because they're unpopular? For some, this was a fight about religious freedom. For others, it was about the right to privacy. And for others still, it was about keeping government power in check. No matter which angle you looked from, the Browns case put the issue in the spotlight. Whether you agree with Kody's choices or not, you can't deny the courage it took to stand up to the law. This was not a quiet, behind-the-scenes legal challenge. This was fought in public. On television, in the headlines, and in the court of public opinion. Every interview was a gamble. Every season of Sister Wives risked giving prosecutors more evidence. Every step forward came with the risk of public ridicule. The Browns opened their home to cameras knowing that half the audience might cheer for them, and the other half might condemn them. And they did it anyway. That level of transparency, and that willingness to face the backlash, is something most families, even those who support plural marriage, have never dared to attempt. The court case didn't end the way they hoped. The appeal was dismissed. There was no final legal precedent declaring Utah's cohabitation ban unconstitutional. But the fight wasn't for nothing. In 2020, Utah lawmakers passed a reform bill that downgraded consensual polygamy between adults from a felony to an infraction, the legal equivalent of a speeding ticket. This meant that for the first time in over a century, plural families in Utah could live openly without the constant fear of prison. Many observers credited the Browns, at least in part, for pushing the conversation forward. Their case, and the national attention it drew, made it harder for lawmakers to ignore the need for reform. The Browns case may have been dismissed in court, but the conversation it started is still alive. In living rooms, online debates, and in legislative halls. When Utah's law changed, it didn't just make headlines locally. News outlets around the country covered it, often referencing Sister Wives and the Browns' long fight. Social media lit up with discussions. Some argued the change was overdue, that consenting adults should be free to live however they choose. Others worried it would open the door to abuse or exploitation. And many simply asked why the government was ever involved in these personal choices to begin with. For Kody, the lawsuit was never just about winning a legal battle. It was about changing the narrative around families like his. Before Sister Wives, polygamy in mainstream media was often depicted in one of two ways: as a relic of the past, associated with isolated compounds and arranged marriages, as a criminal act linked to abuse, fraud, or coercion. The Browns' decision to go public, and to challenge the law head-on, gave the world a different image. A large modern family living in suburbia, with everyday struggles and relatable moments. That visibility didn't erase the stigma, but it chipped away at it. The fight left scars. Relationships within the family have shifted. Some of the bonds that seemed unshakable during the lawsuit years have since broken under different pressures. But the fight also left behind something lasting: a sense of purpose. Even years after the case ended, Kody has said that he doesn't regret taking on Utah's legal system. It was, in his words, a chapter that needed to be written. The kids, now older, have grown up knowing that their family once went to court to defend their right to exist. Whether they choose to follow in their parents' footsteps or live differently, they understand that they come from a family that was willing to fight. If you strip away the polygamy debate for a moment, the Browns' story fits into a much older, broader pattern. People challenging the government's right to regulate their private lives. From interracial marriage bans struck down in the 1960s, to same-sex marriage rulings in the 2010s, to the Browns' own case in the 2010s. Each of these battles has forced society to look at uncomfortable questions, and decide whether laws are truly about protecting people or about enforcing a moral code. The Browns may not be in the history books alongside those landmark cases, but they are part of that larger conversation. Looking back, it's easy to see the dismissal as a defeat. They didn't get the lasting legal precedent they wanted. They didn't win in the way courts define victory. But maybe that was never the only goal. Maybe the victory was the visibility. The fact that families across Utah and across America saw someone stand up and say, "This is who we are, and we're not hiding anymore." Maybe the victory was that lawmakers were pushed, even years later, to soften laws that had gone unchallenged for generations. Maybe the victory was simply in asking the question, a question that once asked can never be unasked: should the government have the power to tell consenting adults who they can love and live with? Kody Brown may never walk into another courtroom for a case like Brown v. Beeman. The chapter is closed. The court records are filed. The cameras have moved on to other storylines. But for the people who watched it unfold, for the families who still live in ways the law doesn't always approve of, the memory of that fight remains. The Browns didn't just defend their home. They shook the walls of the system that tried to tear it down. And whether you see Kody Brown as a trailblazer, a troublemaker, or just a man protecting his family, one truth remains: he changed the conversation. And maybe, just maybe, that was the victory he was chasing all along.